You okay? Great. All right. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. And I thought it was appropriate that you brought in a Wisconsinite to talk about collaboration on Earth Day. I mean, Earth Day is kind of the ultimate collaboration, right? And it's been very sustainable because it's in its 49th year. And next year's the big 50-year celebration. So they really should be celebrating sustainability next year. So we should all start making our plans for how we're going to celebrate a half century of Earth Day. All right. Well, when you first asked me to talk about collaboration, at first I was actually a little bit hesitant because I thought, well, doesn't everybody know about collaboration already? Yeah, everybody in here has probably been part of a collaboration of some sort at some point in time. Probably many of you are collaborating on things right now. So I thought about it a little bit more, and I think the interesting part of it is thinking about the sustainability aspect of it. And I'd like to start with definitions and make sure we're all on the same page. With collaboration, this is a very simple definition of two or more people working together towards shared goals. And I think that captures it fairly well. But another Wisconsin icon also has a great quote. So I'm from Green Bay, Wisconsin. Does everybody know who Vince Lombardi is? Anybody in here don't know who Vince Lombardi is? Oh, well, you're awesome then in that regard. So Vince Lombardi.
Better than Gaylord Nelson.
That could be. So Vince Lombardi led the Green Bay Packers to 7 national championships back in the 1960s, leading up to Earth Day. But as you imagine, somebody who's a coach for a team might have some insights on collaboration, and this was a great quote from him. In terms of the nature of collaboration being an individual commitment, it's not just about being a group, but about individuals making commitment to that group. And it's more than just about working as a team or working on a project. It's actually kind of the essence of who we are as human beings, and that it's how companies work, how our society works, how our civilization works. Probably why we've been successful as a species as well. We've done a lot to kind of understand collaboration and work together in order to do the things we've done as a species through time. Maybe breathe anthropologists can hit more on that. As I was thinking about this presentation a little bit, I love word clouds, and I looked at a number of word clouds around the topic of collaboration, and I was kind of thinking, what are elements that I should be talking about? One thing that struck me, in all of the word clouds I looked at, none of them included the word sustainability in them, which surprised me a little bit, because there are a lot of groups where they might have an objective where they want to sustain their collaboration through time, where that might be actually an implied objective that they might have. But it's not as explicit as I was expecting it to be in some of these situations. So that got me thinking a little bit more about it, and that maybe people don't think about sustainability of collaboration as much as maybe they should. Okay. So in terms of some definitions of sustainability and thinking about what does sustainability actually mean in a collaboration, I broke it down into time frame a little bit. So the first is short term, and I define short term as 5 years or less, thinking about kind of the standard NSF grant duration, or a lot of projects are 5 years or less, maybe 3 years. 5 years is kind of typical for a single project or effort. And though it may not always be easy, it's relatively easy relative to longer term collaborations. How many people here feel like they've fallen into this group either now or in the past? How many people have been part of a short-term collaboration? Most of us have been. Yes, absolutely. So let's think about long-term now. So something longer than 5 years. And this generally means that you are looking at a whole series of objectives, a series of projects, a series of grants. You're looking beyond any one of those things. And the sustainability of that is relatively hard because it's longer term. So how many people have been part of long-term collaborations that have lasted longer than 5 years? Ooh, a lot fewer hands. That tells me right there that maybe it's a little bit harder, right? And this is just the temporal component of it.
Either that or some people are just 5 years old.
Or they're just, yeah, they haven't been, yeah, so there's some young people in here who haven't had maybe the opportunity to collaborate longer than 5 years. There's also a spatial component to this, in that it can also be hard when you're working at very large spatial scales. So I'm going to quiz you a little bit on your spatial extent of your collaborations. How many people have been part of a collaboration that's involved 5 states or more? Ooh. Got one. How about 3 countries or more? Oop, lost David. Oh, got one. How about at the scale of continents or hemispheres? Gone that far? Yeah? Globally? Did you say you had a global collaboration? Okay, I lost everybody at that point. And it may not be that it's because it's hard. It might be because that's beyond the scope of what you're trying to do. It's not that it's bad that you don't have a global collaboration, but certainly it's more challenging. The greater the spatial extent is of the people that you're working with. And that also can start getting into things like language barriers and really trying to figure out if you're all on kind of pulling in the same direction or not. All right, so the first thing to ask yourself is, if you're part of a collaboration, is it desirable to be sustainable long term? It might be that you're happy with a project ending in 4 years and the collaboration ending at that point. That is perfectly fine. But it might be that either from the very beginning you want long-term sustainability beyond 5 years, or it might be that as a short-term collaboration you decide, wow, this is going really well, I like the people we're working with, this is, let's turn this short-term collaboration into a long-term collaboration. Does anybody find themselves in that situation? Is anybody in a short-term collaboration where they'd like to make it longer term? So at least one person or two are in that situation. So what are kind of the key elements? I guess the question is, if the answer to this is yes, we would like to have long-term sustainability as a group. And I will say that this is largely going to be my own reflections through the lens of bird conservation. And I don't necessarily research this topic, so this is more kind of anecdotal of my own experience as a little kind of footnote here. So what are some of the elements of long-term sustainability? Well, one of them is being strategic, and I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. The other is thinking about your leadership structure. What are the roles and responsibilities of the collaborators? What is your capacity, or what might you want your capacity to be? Communication. What are your communication tools and procedures? And finally, adaptability. How adaptive are you as a collaboration? So I'm going to talk about each of these briefly. Okay, let's start with being strategic. This is an important question to ask. Basically, are we all on the same page? And it can be surprising because you might start off thinking you're all on the same page. Just as a kind of a side story here, went through a whole lengthy strategic planning process with a group of people, and we're past that, we're in the implementation stage, and we're talking about conserving migratory birds, and we get to this point where we, after talking about bird migration for months and actually probably 2 years, we realized that we weren't all on the same page in terms of how we were defining movements of migratory animals, and that we were defining it differently amongst ourselves. So even just small details you might find are really important when it gets down to the nitty-gritty, because if you're not all on the same page, you're going to have other issues with communication and understanding what your objectives are and how you're going to move forward with those objectives. So making sure you're on the same page. So how do you go about doing that? Well, there's a number of things that you want to have in common. So do we share the same vision in terms of where we're headed, our mission, how we're going to get there, what's important to us in terms of our core values? What are our goals? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the objectives that we are prioritizing in terms of trying to achieve those goals? What are the strategies we're going to use in pursuing those objectives? And finally, what are the individual actions or activities that we're going to use? And those might come in the form of initiatives or focal projects in this process. And collectively, this is basically a strategic plan. And I don't know how many of you have been how many people have been part of strategic planning? A couple people, 2 or 3 people. I don't know if those of you that have been part of strategic planning, when you hear that word, you like go screaming and running from the room, because it can be a big undertaking. And I've been part of strategic planning processes where I haven't really bought into the process or the outcome, where I felt like this was a waste of time because I felt like we were doing this just as an exercise and not because it was actually going to be something that we were going to use. So before entering into this process, it's important to actually think about this Dilbert cartoon, which is about making sure that it's useful in the end. So you want to make sure whatever you're investing your time in is going to be useful. And a strategic plan can be many different things. I've seen great strategic plans that are only 1 page long, and it may have come out of just a 1 to 2 day process where they kind of ran through that vision, mission, core values process. Sometimes you can do that really quickly. When you truly are all on the same page, sometimes it's just a matter of putting those things down on paper and it can go quickly. So it can be really simple like that, and it may only be a short time commitment. On the flip side, it might be that you want a lot of detail in terms of your strategic plan. And in that event, it might be a very lengthy process. It might take a year, maybe it'll take longer. And it might be a long document because you have a lot of details you want to convey in that. And that's okay. There's no one right strategic plan here. It's really a matter of figuring out what's going to be useful. Okay, next component, leadership structure. And I'm going to kind of compare what I think is sustainable versus less sustainable in terms of models from my experience. So sustainable models tend to be where there's a leadership structure that has a steering committee or board, where there's a group of people that are helping give direction to what the group is doing. The second part of this is a leadership team. And the leadership team is often a subgroup of that steering committee. So it's usually 3 or 4 individuals who do a lot of the work, we'll say. They're the ones that do a lot of the organization of the steering committee meetings. They are the ones that are lining up people and getting a lot of things done, maybe taking the lead on a strategic planning process or looking for grants or whatnot. So they're the people that do a lot of hard work within that steering committee. The third is having a kind of dedicated point person as your kind of identified leader. So that could be a chairperson, a president, an executive director, and more I'm seeing that groups have more than one of these as well. So what's unsustainable? What's unsustainable and where I see collaborations fall apart is when their leadership is dependent on only 1 or 2 people. All it takes is one key person to walk away and the collaboration kind of falls apart. So you don't want a leadership model that's too overly dependent on one person. The other part of it is where your leadership team, these people that are doing a bulk of the work, are not being compensated for their time. And we are all very busy people. We all have a lot on our plates, and we're having to prioritize what we're spending our time on. And this is no different in a collaboration. And in order for, and these are people usually that are maybe employed by different organizations and agencies and universities and whatnot. In order for all of those people to get their supervisors to agree to them to be part of this collaboration, having compensation helps. It's not necessary always, but in some situations it really does help, making sure that the people that are trying to commit time have the support higher up in their organization. So compensation can be very important. Another part of it is when the members on your leadership team are not given the space to be a leader. It's no fun being a leader in name only if you're not being given the functionality to take on leadership roles. And this is really important in terms of how you define roles and responsibilities of people that are in your leadership positions. It should be clear what's expected of them. So when you offer them such a position, they know what they're getting into and so that they can go to their supervisor and say, well, this is what they're expecting me to do. So having clear roles and responsibilities is really important, but you also then need to give those people the space to do those things that they're charged with, right? All right, the next one's capacity. And when I talk about capacity, I'm thinking about things like resources and people's time. How much can you dedicate to this collaboration? We all have limits. We all have other things that we're doing. So we can't give, in most cases, our full attention to this. So there's a capacity limit. And so the first part of being sustainable is understanding when you take on initiatives and projects that it's within the current capacity of the group. And so you have to really understand what your capacity is in order to do that well. So there's kind of two parts to that. The other part is often we want our capacity to be larger than it is currently. So there's a need to constantly be looking for new resources to expand the capacity of the collaboration. And then the other part of it is identifying roles that fit their capacity. So making sure that the people that you have involved have the right kind of skill sets, that they have the right amount of time, that their capacity fits what you're trying to do as a group. And what's unsustainable is one, when you strive to do too much. And you might have a strategic plan, and it might be that you're trying to implement the whole strategic plan, but it might be that you don't have the capacity to implement the whole strategic plan. So you need to prioritize and pick and choose what are going to be the things we're going to implement here. So that's really important. So just because you say you're going to do something strategically may not mean you have the capacity to do it. The next part is selecting initiatives that just exceed group capacity. And it somewhat goes also with the last one of members over committing, is that sometimes you think, oh, this is a great idea, we're really excited about this, but it fizzles because it exceeds the capacity of the people involved, or members overcommit. They think that they're going to have more capacity than they have in the end. So being very thoughtful about capacity is important. Okay, communication. We could have probably a whole seminar series just on communication alone. Communication, obviously very important. Sustainable practices are selecting communication practices that work effectively for your group. What works for one group might not be the same that works for another group. So knowing what's going to work for your group is important. Having a discussion about that is important. And there's two kind of key elements to communication. There's internal communication, so communications within your group, within your steering committee or your leadership team, maybe with your members. What does that look like? What are the tools you're going to use there? They might be different tools than what you're going to use externally. And externally might be to new collaborators that you might be seeking. It might be to other stakeholders, especially those that you're trying to maybe develop things for. So it's important to think about how you're going to communicate with those two different types of groups. And the tools that you employ are probably going to be different for those two things. The other one is having multiple communication tools. Not everybody communicates well the same way. So having multiple communication tools allows different ways of reaching people. Whether that's social media or websites or other types of public platforms or different types of media. There's a lot of different ways of communicating and making sure that whatever you use is going to be effective for your group. And finally, making sure that kind of communication is happening regularly. And that goes along with the last point, which is who's responsible for the communications. The only way communications are going to happen regularly if there's dedicated person to this task. And it might be that you have more than one person involved in this. One person might be in charge of internal communications. Another person might be in charge of external communications, especially if the tools are different that you're using for those two things. So that's really important. And it's unsustainable really when any of those things are not well defined or implemented. Okay, so our sustainability model in terms of collaboration. First, I need to say there is no one right model. Not all groups function the same way. And you don't necessarily have to have every one of these elements working well in order to be a functional group. So you can be somewhat dysfunctional and still get things done. So keep that in mind. The best model tends to be one that works for your group, maintains forward progress, continue to achieve the objectives that you're working on, keeps the group on task. And this is why being strategic is so important. It's easy to drift or expand your scope too much, where you are suddenly not accomplishing things. So trying to keep your group on task is important. And then being adaptable, especially if you're thinking long term. The things that were important to the group in year 1 might be different than what's important to the group in year 7. And so you need to kind of continue to revisit these different elements and see if there are different ways in which things can be done. And it might be that your objectives are shifting. It might be that there's new communication tools you want to use. It's maybe you want to try a different leadership structure. But being adaptable is important so that the group continues to function well and in a way that's positive for everybody that's involved. All right, so I want to reflect a little bit specifically on some of the bird conservation collaborations that I've been part of, and just kind of give you a couple different examples of what's worked, and they're kind of different models that I'm going to talk about, and just kind of give you a little bit of flavor here. So the first I'm going to talk about are migration networks, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. And the second one I'm going to use is the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group. And I want to talk a little bit too about what are some of the outcomes. So when you are successful in sustaining collaborations, what can you do? What's the power of that collaboration? All right, let's start with bird migration networks. And this is where some of my background is, kind of explains my interest in this topic. So this is where conservation and international relations comes together, is when you're talking about bird migration, because they're covering continents and hemispheres and multiple countries and states and people of different cultures and backgrounds. So for me, studying migratory birds is more about than just studying birds. It's about studying all the people that they connect as well. They're great international ambassadors in that regard. And when we study bird migration, this is actually a really difficult part of their annual cycle for us to study. It's easier when they're stationary on their breeding grounds or stationary on their wintering grounds. It's much trickier to try and understand what's happening when they're moving across these vast spaces. And so there have been a number of bird migration networks that have formed to try to better understand this amazing phenomenon of migration. And so who are the collaborators that are part of this? Well, they are bird banders, they're researchers, other bird conservation practitioners that are all interested in better understanding migration ecology. Another thing that they have in common is that they create consistent standards of data collection in order to promote answering large-scale questions. If we're not all collecting data the same way, we can't pool it together and look at things on a broad scale. So it's important that we collaborate in the way that we look at our data, collect our data, and make it so that we can look at things at large scales. Okay, so what are the big bird migration networks in North America? There are currently 4 of them. There are probably some lesser, smaller ones that I don't have on here, but these are the big ones. So the first one, the oldest one, is the Canadian Migration Monitoring Network, which is a network of bird banding stations all across Canada. The second one is the Land Bird Monitoring Network of the Americas, LAMNA for short. It started off on the West Coast, kind of in the California, Oregon neighborhood, and has really expanded across North America and internationally. The third one is one that's local to this area, the Northeast Regional Migration Monitoring Network, and it includes the northeastern U.S. as well as kind of southeast Canada as well, so Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, some of those provinces in the adjacency to Maine here. And then the last one is the newest one, the Midwest Migration Network, and this is the one for which I'm actually coordinator. And I'm going to get to that here in a moment. One thing that I did as we were forming our network and working on our strategic plan, the first thing that I undertook was I interviewed the coordinators of these other networks because I wanted to better understand how they function. What can we learn from them in terms of as we were forming our network? So I'm going to reflect a little bit on that as well as pulling in some elements from other similar groups. So what made these networks sustainable? One is that most of them had a strategic plan in place, or at least some of those key principles had been discussed and written down. You could go on their website and find it too, was kind of critical. They all had a steering committee leadership structure to them. So they all had a group of people, and they were generally a pretty diverse group as well. There were 1 to 2 co-chairs, 2 being more common than 1. They had regular leadership meetings, and often they were in person, at least once a year, an in-person meeting. You can imagine some of these are pretty vast areas. Trying to get everybody from across Canada is a big undertaking, for example. So a lot of it ends up being done through, say, like video conferencing or whatnot as well. But a lot of these groups do make an effort to have some sort of annual in-face meeting, which I think is important. They all have internal communication tools in place for maintaining communications. A lot of them are by email, but there's other tools being used too. Many of them have terms of reference. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar to you, but basically what this is kind of documenting what your structure looks like. So what does your leadership structure look like? How do you become a member of the steering committee, for example? Do you just ask to be on the steering committee? Do you have to be invited by somebody? Does the whole group have to vote on you in order to become part of the steering committee? What's your process? What does it look like in terms of, you know, the functionality of your leadership team? So that's part of it. Part of it is also the structure of your organization. Are you going to have committees? Are they permanent? Are they ad hoc committees? Who's on those committees? How do those committees operate? What are they trying to accomplish? You know, there's a lot of things that you can put in terms of reference, but they're basically about how does your organization work, basically. Communicating externally is also something they all had in common. They all had opportunities for new people to become involved. They communicated regularly about what they were doing so that other people interested in migration have a sense of what the group is doing, what are they accomplishing. And also having really easily accessible resources. So say you are trying to go make sure all your bird banding stations are collecting data the same way, having those protocols and data sheets and all of that easily accessible online at a place where everybody can find them is really important. And in a format that everybody can use. And then finally, they all had funding and in many cases dedicated long-term resources to build and maintain capacity. And some of the dedicated resources were probably the most common are actually agency collaborators, where part of their job duties was defined as serving as part of as a collaborator. So it was kind of a part of your job, and it was clearly defined that way. Those are probably some of the best ways of dedicating resources is when you can actually have it built into the job description. It makes it harder for people to change what you do. Not that you can't, but it's nice when it's kind of codified in your job description. All right. So I've mentioned these 4 bird migration networks, and the sustainability part of it really has worked for 3 of them. One of them has recently disappeared. The biggest problem, and that's unfortunately our regional migration network, in that it was dependent on one leader. And that person has walked away and nobody has stepped up to replace that leader. And so this network currently is kind of captainless, and so there has been no effort for communication or meetings or any kind of collaboration because we lost the one linchpin that held everything together. as a result of that, a new group has formed last year. It's the Northeast MODIS Network. And anybody in here know what MODIS is? 3 or 4 of you. So MODIS, just to give you a little background, is a really interesting network of receiving towers. And so if you put little VHF tags on animals that move, and that could be birds or bats or dragonflies or butterflies, these towers that you see pictured here, this guy here, that's a MODIS tower. It's a permanent receiving station, and anytime one of those tags comes within, say, 10 kilometers of it, it records it. It says, yep, tag 56789 was here on this time and date. It doesn't give you a pinpoint location like a GPS does, but it lets you know that that animal was in the vicinity of that tower. So for short, small movements, this is not real great technology, but for animals that move across continents, this is great technology because it allows you to kind of roughly track where animals are, how fast it takes them to get from point A to point B. It allows you to understand when things depart or arrive in different places. And so this is a really interesting network, and I'm going to come back to this. But many of the members of the Northeast Regional Network have now become part of this new network. But it's very specific. It's not a broad kind of migration ecology network. It's very specific, focused on this one technology, at least for the moment. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the network for which I'm coordinator, which is the Midwest Migration Network. And this was formed in 2012, and it has members from Canada and 16 states. And I became coordinator in 2013. And the practices that we've employed that have made us sustainable is we have a strategic plan. We have a leadership structure with a coordinator, which is me, a steering committee of, I think we're up to 14 members now. One way to increase your capacity is to keep adding more steering committee members. We're probably at a point where we're probably maxed out, but it's hard to get more than 14 people on one conference call. We have a leadership team. Currently, there are 3 of us that do a lot of the work for the group. And then we have ad hoc committees. Right now we have a communication committee that's really been developing new communication tools for us, which has been really important part of our kind of development process. We have very clear roles. They're written down. Whenever I invite a new person to join our steering committee, I send out a document and say, this is what we expect of our committee members, and you should feel free to have this discussion with your supervisor. Let us know if this is acceptable for you. Our capacity is really dependent on our steering committee and our leaders. Fortunately, we've had funding to compensate our leadership team for some of their time, which really helps in terms of getting things done. We have multiple communication tools. We have a Facebook page, we have a website, we have email lists. The last one actually is we have a dedicated membership list. We have about 180 collaborators in the network right now, and we have a very easy membership process where all you have to do is fill out a short form on our website and you get deposited into our database. And our database is also organized by some of our research initiatives. So then we know if you're interested in being part of this MODIS network. Anytime we have that discussion, we invite those people to be part of that discussion. What's unsustainable about what we're doing is our capacity is lower than where we want it to be, and it's very dependent on external grants right now. So we still have challenges, even though we're about 8 years or so into our collaboration. So what have we kind of been accomplishing? So remember those MODIS towers, those pictures that I showed you? All of those yellow dots is one of those towers. And the orange dots is the Midwest Migration Network's vision for where we'd like there to be towers in the future. And the idea is that you create fences where it's impossible for, say, a bird or a bat to fly through that fence without being detected, right? So it's a kind of a tower net in order of being able to kind of catch birds as they're going north and south on fall and spring migration, or bats or other migrating animals. And actually it's only recent that the yellow dots up around Lake Superior and lower Peninsula Michigan Those are pretty much the last year that those have just come online. And in the next 6 months, all these new yellow dots are what we have planned as a network. And this is using a bunch of different collaborators in different parts of our region. So this is kind of what we've got planned right now. Some of it's dependent on funding, but some of it's off our grid, some of it's building towers on our grid. So it's kind of a mixture of both things, but we're making forward progress towards our vision of kind of a collaborative network of towers. One of our other big initiatives is to work with our bird banding stations in the region. So all those numbers on that map represents a bird banding station. And our hope is that in the next year or two, we will have all of them using the same banding protocol during migration. We've started holding workshops, like in this picture here, where we're training banders and banding stations on our protocol. So we've developed a standardized protocol where we have online data upload and entry, where information that's not going to the bird banding lab, so like the bands that people are putting on, that goes to the bird banding lab federally. But all the other information comes to us through the Midwest Avian Network, which is a different type of kind of archival data structure. But anyway, so this is kind of two of the things that we've been successful at so far as a network in terms of working at large scales. Okay, I want to switch over to my other case study, which is the Golden Wing Warbler Working Group. I am co-chair of this group as well. It was formed in 2003, and we have members from Canada to Colombia and South America, roughly around 80 different collaborators in basically every state and country where this little bird is found. This is a golden wing warbler here. This is a male. It's only 9 grams, little guy, about the size of a chickadee. But migratory bird, spends its summers in the Midwest through the Appalachian region, spends its winters in Central and South America. And the intent is to work to conserve this bird. It's on a long-term decline. We've lost 60% of its population in the last 60 years. And it's still on kind of a, it's still in jeopardy. And the Appalachian population, we've lost over 95% of that population. So it's kind of on its last legs in terms of whether that population is going to be sustainable. Our leadership structure originally started as a steering committee with a single chairperson and permanent committees. Since then we've shifted. We still have a steering committee, but now we have co-chairs. So I have a co-chair as well, which is really helpful in terms of kind of division of duties. And now our committees are more ad hoc, as needed. Sustainability practices of this group have actually been a little bit on the poor side. Our capacity is fairly low, but when it's needed, people step up. So we've got a great steering committee that will put time in when time is needed. The unsustainable part of it is we've been somewhat inconsistent in our activity through time. When we were dependent on one co-chair, it kind of relied on when that person was available versus not, when things were kind of being, when kind of leadership activities, I guess, were happening. So going to the 2 co-chair model has been helpful in that regard. There's no strategic plan, so we tend to be very reactionary to the things that we do. And like I said, our capacity is really limited by our steering committee, so we don't do a very good job of using the energy of non-steering committee members. We've got a membership of over 80 people, actually it's probably higher than that now, representing every manner of organization and agency in multiple countries, that we're just not utilizing as well as we could be. And then finally, our communication is weak outside of our steering committee. We have good internal communication, but our external communication needs work. But despite that, I'm going to give you a little timeline of what we've accomplished as a working group. So even when you're a little bit dysfunctional, you still can achieve some decent things. So let's see what we've done as a group. So 2003 was when the group formed. 2005, I organized the first kind of large-scale working group meeting, a workshop in Wisconsin that brought together stakeholders, 80 different stakeholders together at that workshop, and really launched the working group and we really sat down and thought strategically for the first time about what is it that we really need. And what we really needed at that time was information. We were really lacking information about the species on the breeding grounds, especially how population demographics relate to habitat management in particular. So we set out to get money for a multi-study site project. We ended up with 9 different study sites across the breeding range of golden wing warbler, where we all were using the same protocols, following kind of the same objectives for 3 years in order to really gather information about how to manage for this species. Kind of simultaneous to this, we undertook a genetic atlas. Golden wing warbler hybridizes with its sister species, the blue-winged warbler. And one of the things we didn't understand is to what degree are these two species intergressed genetically? How much overlap is there genetically going on? Even though their ranges are spatially separate somewhat, they do overlap, but we weren't sure to the degree of kind of this genetic overlap. And what we discovered is that they were much more genetically integrated than we had thought previously. So in 2009, we published our genetic atlas. Around that same time, we developed educational materials. The other big need that we saw is that people didn't know what a golden wing warbler was. And even though it was one of the fastest declining land birds in North America, people had no idea what that was or that it was in that much trouble. So we did a lot of education. So this brochure right here, I think I printed and distributed like 14,000 copies of it. We had 3 different posters. I distributed probably over 10,000 of those. And in addition to that, we had a lot of we developed our website, we did lots of presentations, we really got the word out about what was going on with this species. In 2012, we wrote a conservation plan for the species. This was done in conjunction with the Fish and Wildlife Service. About the same time as when the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was petitioned to list the golden wing warbler for protection under the Endangered Species Act, and this launched a big review process federally. So this conservation plan was really at a critical time and was really helpful for the Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of understanding the status of the species. And so I was actually the lead editor of this document. At the same time, now that we had information, it was time to really implement that information. And so NRCS really stepped up to the plate. Does everybody know what NRCS is as a federal agency? Natural Resources Conservation Service. It's a federal agency. They do a lot of work with private landowners to implement conservation. A lot of what they do are cost share programs to help landowners pay for implementing habitat management or environmental protection changes on their property. And at this time, the Working Lands for Wildlife program came out. And this came out of the old WIP program. And what they did is they consolidated all those resources into trying to help just a handful of species. So rather than a shotgun approach for everything everywhere, they decided, I think it was eight species maybe, that they just were going to really focus on. And golden wing warbler was going to be one of them. So this is where suddenly tens of millions of dollars every year were being poured into breeding habitat for this species. So a lot of money getting dedicated to this. 2013, so about 6 months after the conservation plan came out, we produced our best management practices, which was a whole series of documents to help land managers and landowners make decisions to improve habitat for the golden wing warbler. And then in 2015, so this is data from the Breeding Bird Survey. Does anybody not know what the Breeding Bird Survey is? So that's a national volunteer-based program that's been going on since 1966. It's a road-based survey where you go out in June for the most part and you count birds. And this is our baseline for how we look at population trends for many species across North America, is based on this survey because there's thousands of these routes out there. Actually over 4,100, I just looked this up, 4,100 routes across North America that volunteers are out running. And from this, you get trend information. So I'm going to blow this graphic up. This is the golden wing warbler's range-wide population trend. You can see that big 60% population decline. This is a plummet when you're a bird. The good news is since we've really implemented our education program, we've seen a bit of an uptick, and at least I'd say we probably at least stabilized the population, if not shown some increases. The problem is this survey is not the greatest in tracking this species anymore. In the Appalachians, it completely fails because we're down to less than 5% of what was there before. The birds are up in high elevations where there are no routes anymore, so it's really hard to track exactly what we're doing and how effective we are. But the fact that we are showing an uptick on this survey, I think, is really promising and suggests that maybe all our hard work has been paying off a little bit. All right, so conclusions. The first thing to determine if your collaboration is long-term sustainability an objective for you? If the answer is yes, you want to have some sense of what's the lifetime of your collaboration. Is this a collaboration of 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? How long do you want to be around? Be strategic. Write down what your strategy is going to be, no matter how short of a document it might be. If it's 1 page, great. 1 page is better than no pages. Develop a leadership structure, especially one that's not dependent on only 1 or 2 people. Codify your structure and any terms of reference about how your collaboration is going to function. And this is true for research as well. I mean, this can be who are the authors going to be on these papers? Who's going to be in charge of data management? Who's going to have access to the data? Those kinds of things. So this works in research just like it does in just about anything else. It's about codifying that, putting that down on paper so that in 5 years somebody goes, well, I thought I was going to have access to that data, right? And now I don't. Why not? Because you weren't on that list in the beginning. Be transparent and communicate regularly. The other aspect of this. This is my email address if you have questions. And I put up your Partners in Flight. Partners in Flight is an international program of bird conservation collaborators. And I'm actually going to one of their meetings tomorrow, interestingly, where we are launching the Eastern Working Group, which is a working group of working groups. So we'll see if we can bring together all of the Eastern bird working groups into one umbrella. So I'm going to be thinking about some of these principles as we're talking about bringing all these different groups. There's probably 20 of them together and thinking about how might we make that work. So that's my task the rest of the week, actually, is building collaboration. So thank you. Questions?
Thank you so much for this. I was really interested in how the framework that you set up was carried forward into the case examples. In particular, I'm thinking like cross species. So the definition of collaboration emphasizing inter-human relationships, but then in the case studies, so deep those collaborations seem so deeply connected to the sustainability of the bird population. Mm-hmm. So what I'm wondering is do the groups have a way of understanding themselves through the number of species they study? Does that impact the sustainability of the group? As one example.
That's a good question. Actually, that's a good one for this group right here, Partners in Flight, because its target is all land birds in North America, and not just in the U.S. That includes Mexico and Canada, and resident birds that we don't have here. So they have this task of trying to figure out how do we prioritize conservation for 1,000 different bird species, right, that fall under their umbrella. And so they've come up with tools that allow us to prioritize and understand where there are overlap across broad suites of species. So we've identified suites of species that are also declining, not just individual species. So it really starts bringing together these ideas of sustaining, whole ecosystems of individuals, not just single species. And so I think we're trying to more broadly try to stitch together being broader thinking and being sustainable across a broad number of species. And I think that's part of the reason for this Eastern Working Group meeting. There's a lot of working groups that are around single species like golden wing warbler. I'm part of one around rusty blackbirds and another one around Bicknell thrush, but kind of bringing all these groups together in a way where we might have shared goals and objectives and seeing if we can be even more effective when we bring all these working groups together. I think it's going to be interesting to see where we find the common ground. I don't know, I may be kind of going beyond your question at this point, but
But I think
yeah.
like it really
Yeah.
connects back to I think the point you made about like leadership and
Mhm.
I don't think you use like redundancy language, but it seems like a kind of redundancy. It's not just relying on one
it is, yeah.
person, but also here not just relying on the livelihood or the sustainability of single species.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, there's a parallel there. And I would say the leadership structure is sort of an embedded kind of hierarchy of there is a coordinator, but that coordinator is part of a leadership team of several people, which is also part of the steering committee of even more people. So the redundancy is in, I think that there's layers to it and that there's people that have different roles and responsibilities at each of those layers, but there's depth, right? in your whole leadership structure. So that's what makes it sustainable. So that if you do lose any one person at any one of those layers, it's supported by the other layers, right? So you could lose your coordinator, but that's okay. You still have a leadership team, you still have a steering committee, you can find a new coordinator. You don't find a new coordinator if there's only one person in your leadership structure. There's no one to find the new person, right? And that's where the breakdown happens, is that continuity. So kind of building continuity, yeah. And yeah, you're right, it does sort of mirror what we're trying to do with bird conservation, yeah, absolutely.
Any questions? Well, let's thank Amber again, and please come next door if you want to join us for some more conversation.